Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the wild, weird, and wacky world of the Word. Hey, take that cup of coffee right now. Have a good sip of it, or a good gulp like I just did, because it's a little chilly outside, and we might have some sloppy weather ahead, but who knows? Hopefully not a whole lot of snow or rain comes down. But sloppy is anything but the word to describe the Gospel of Matthew. And I thought we'd take a little overview of Matthew's Gospel for today, because that's the Gospel we'll be focusing on the most during Cycle A of our Revised Common Lectionary. Now, you might say, well, it only makes sense. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, right? That's the order of our Gospels. Well, then you have to ask, why is it in that order? Well, the quick and easy answer is all of our ancient lists that we have going back as far as we can go, and the earliest that we have, all have them listed in that order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you look at it, it kind of makes sense, because Matthew, he has this penchant for calling upon Old Testament references in scriptures to validate what he's saying in his gospel. Yeah, it's kind of cool. We have that happening today, or rather tomorrow, in our gospel reading in church, where it talks about the lands of Naphtali and Zebulun and the Gentiles of the Galilees and stuff like that. Well, yeah, that comes out of Isaiah, which is our Old Testament reading this coming Sunday. And Matthew says, hey, that fulfills this saying. And he does that like a dozen times, maybe more than that, in his gospel. So, yeah, okay, let's put Matthew first. But also, it's interesting because, well, just a little smidget of history helps us to understand better what's going on. At the time of Jesus, Judaism wasn't one cohesive whole. There were four major groups in it that were kind of, in some regards, vying for supremacy. You had your Pharisees, your Sadducees, the Essenes, and then a little bit later you had what were called the Nazarenes. The Nazarenes would be those who now were followers of that man from Nazareth, Jesus, okay? But now all of them still existed together as Judaism, and they got along, didn't get along with each other, but they said, all right, just kind of keep that particular thing that you believe a little quiet when you enter the temple. Let's just worship Yahweh when we go in there, even though even then they had some different ways of doing that. All right, so you had those four groups, but then a pretty bad thing happened in 66 AD, and that's when all of a sudden there was this big Jewish rebellion within the Palestine area, and it was not looking good for the Jews. The Romans really started clamping down, and by 70, Jerusalem was destroyed. Temple was destroyed as well. So pretty tough times. And what happens is, after that, there's only two of those groups that remain. One was the Pharisees, and the other were the Nazarenes. The Pharisees kind of went off up into the north area, and the Nazarenes went a little further to the north and east into Syria. And why do we say that? Well, a lot of our very early, and it's even testified to in the book of Acts, earliest Jesus follower action, if you want to call it, because they weren't called Christians quite yet. A little bit later they were. But the Jewish Jesus followers, their activity was found there in Antioch. And the Pharisees, they remained in the Galilee area and were able to kind of pull things together. But as far as the Essenes and the Sadducees, they were gone. No more. Essenes were already kind of on their way out, but in the Sadducees, well, they were based pretty much on temple worship. And with the temple destroyed, they had nowhere to go, nothing to do. Bye-bye. All right. And so what we have happening is Matthew seems to talk a lot about, and you can see hints of this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees all the way through. Is that more talking about the conflict between Jesus' followers and the Pharisees? That's a very big possibility. And that could be some of the things that are being addressed in the gospel. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that this gospel was probably written very shortly after the Romans had destroyed Jerusalem and these other groups had fled for their own survival. And here now we have a gospel that is written primarily to help the Jews, Jesus followers, hang on to their faith. And maybe they were even beginning to question their faith. And why all this is going on and this, that, and the other. Okay, so you have that. To keep in mind, it helps us to understand a little more of the reference point of some of the things that are going on within the gospel itself. Now, okay, we talk about where it was written, and who is another question. We don't know. There's nothing within the gospel that says who wrote this. The earliest hint we have is an early church leader named Papias who talks about these sayings of Matthew. And now he died around 130 of the Common Era AD. So his references to the sayings, is he making reference to this gospel that's already put together? Or is he making reference to a group of sayings that Matthew had his hand on that he was using in his teachings? And who's Matthew? We just don't know. We don't know. Was it the tax collector? Well, that would push it way back to even earlier than 75 AD. That push it back to almost Jesus' time, right? But although it could be still written after the fall of Jerusalem. We just don't know. And it doesn't really matter. But what it helps us do is put this gospel together, because as we go through the year, we're going to see, hey, there's kind of a structure to Matthew that makes a lot of sense as to why it is listed first in the Gospels. Not just because it has so many Older Testament references, but because of the way it's put together. And one of the ways it's put together is in 5 major blocks. And it has like a little narrative section about Jesus and what's happening to him. Then it has a big teaching section, then another narrative session, and a big teaching session. And each one of these sections finishes with these exact same words. Now when Jesus had finished. See, it's nice and neat. Now, there's only one problem with that. You have to eliminate the birth of Jesus and the death and resurrection of Jesus at that point, and use them not as major blocks or teaching segments, but as a prologue and an epilogue. Yeah, that works. And so a lot of people will teach the Gospel of Matthew based on that. But there's also another way, and that's by putting together 3 larger blocks that are separated by in between the first and second by a certain reference, and then the second and third section by the same words. From that time on, Jesus began to. Okay? And that works as well. So you have those 2 ways that are most commonly used to divide up. Although when you divide up the gospel in that last way, man, that's some big chunks of Matthew they have to deal with all at once. But again, it gets all to the question of why was the gospel written in the first place? And there seems to be a lot of look, and the common and most popular way to talk about it is this is a catechism that Matthew wrote. Catechism? Yeah. An instructional manual on the life of Jesus and the life of the Christian, how we live our lives. And look at it. Jesus did a lot of teaching throughout his career, right? So let's focus in on those teachings. 5 big blocks of teachings that we have throughout the gospel. So however you might want to look at it, it still is listed as number 1 in our Bibles. And I'll tell you, if you ever did want to sit down and decide, and maybe one of your New Year's resolutions would be, I'm going to memorize one of the Gospels. I know I cannot remember the name of the gentleman who had memorized the entire Gospel of Mark and was going around to different places and in dramatic form speaking the Gospel of Mark. Like I said, I can't remember his name. It was a few years back. But yeah, well, Mark is short. Matthew's long. But in essence, it's easier to memorize because of those 5 sections of narrative and then teaching. And then just pop on the prologue and the epilogue. There you have it. And you can do it. You can do it. So, all this is by way of introduction to the gospel itself, especially as we see that there is so much in the way of Old Testament references moving into the gospel itself. So, yeah, that would put it number 1. But also number 2, it really does help us understand who we are as Christians and what we are about, especially as we focus in on the teachings that Jesus gave to those first century Jewish people who were God-fearers, Yahweh followers, and they would now become not only Yahweh followers, but Jesus followers, who later on would be given the name Christian. Okay, God's blessings be with you this day, and enjoy your day. I'm just going to sit out here and finish drinking my coffee because it is so nice and peaceful. I hear the birds singing, and occasionally I have a truck roll by, and you may have heard a few of those during this talk. But otherwise, God's blessings be with you, and have a great day.